So this morning I watched a TED Talk on YouTube about consciousness. It was a philosopher, David Chalmers, who was discussing the issues around consciousness and understanding it and what it is and why it is and so forth. And I won't go into all the technical details of that, but I thought it was really an interesting way to start the talk, and it's something that I often do, which is simply just point out the fact that there's a movie playing inside of you, inside of your head, produced by the brain, apparently, that demonstrates the sense fields as an internal experience, such that it appears that there's a three-dimensional world. It appears that there is an ongoing narrative and there's an internal dialogue. There's other characters, but we're identifying with a central character. And that movie's ongoing all day long, essentially. And that's a good way to introduce consciousness, just to get somebody's attention and to redirect their attention to that internal movie such that they're standing apart from it, which is also in and of itself very interesting that you can do, because you can actually just be living that internal movie without being consciously aware of the fact that you're living the internal movie. And this is mind identification, right? So in one sense, you could say the first step of starting to investigate consciousness is to become aware of it as such. To remind yourself, oh yeah, I have been sort of hypnotized with a movie inside my head for hours, yeah? Now, when that's solid, when the hypnosis with that movie is so solid that we essentially forget that we're not all of that storyline, that narrative, those motifs, the beliefs, the reflected visual images in the mind, when we forget that we're not that, and that hypnosis is pretty solid, then we really start to live in an alternative reality, like truly bizarre place. But it's also called being human, or you could call it the human condition. So I think it's really valuable to become aware of this. And I would say most people watching this channel are already quite aware of this and have even had shifts in identity beyond the initial recognition of this. And many have had very significant shifts in identity. So the next part of the TED Talk, he starts discussing the hard problem of consciousness, or what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, which I won't go into a lot of detail about, but to me, I always think it's kind of funny when I hear that there's a hard problem of consciousness. And the problem is described as, why is it here? Not as much what it does, like the behavioral aspects that can be studied in a more objective, scientific way, but why? Why is there consciousness? What is it? Is it the fundamental root of all reality, somehow the essence of reality, or is it an emergent property, et cetera, et cetera? The funny thing, the reason I think this is funny is that all of that analysis, all of that afterthought is only a function of consciousness. It's only a function of consciousness. It's already an after-the-fact experience. The feeling of being the one wondering about consciousness. You could say it's an emergent property of consciousness. Forget about whether consciousness is an emergent property. You're identified as an emergent property of consciousness, as a self in consciousness, wondering about consciousness or wondering about anything. So it's really kind of a paradoxical joke that that's even happening, that someone can wonder as an emergent property of consciousness themselves what the nature of consciousness is, right? This is kind of how ego functions and why it's so sneaky. So the next part of what he says is really good. And he says this, he says, because of this hard problem of consciousness, or this challenge that we've had with identifying what consciousness actually is and what its essence is and so forth, we need to have a sort of radical approach. We need to find a sort of crazy idea because what we've done in the past hasn't worked, at least from the philosophical perspective, which is great. I love that. I love that he said that. But the funny thing is, the next thing he does is offers other conceptual paradigms. Oh, well, this is a really radical conceptual paradigm. This is a really radical conceptual paradigm. There's nothing radical about that. It's all conceptual still, right? He's right in that you need a radical approach if you really want to start to understand consciousness. But the radical approach is, it's not about understanding. It's not about knowledge. It's not about having a paradigm. You have to go directly into the experience itself. You have to go directly into the experience of consciousness itself, of being conscious. That's the radical approach. And it's not new. It's old. But it's hidden in plain sight because of the issue I talked about a few minutes ago, which is the sneaky ego. The ego is that ability to very quickly re-identify with the thinker, the one that wonders, the one that thinks there's a hard problem of consciousness, and thus remains an emergent property of consciousness. You'll never know whether consciousness itself is an emergent property until you really know what consciousness is. And the only way you know what consciousness is to go beyond all conceptual grasping, dualistic subject-object construct within consciousness that experiences itself as what feels like you. You have to go beyond that. It's the only way. That's the radical answer. What makes it radical? What makes it difficult? Well, first of all, in the world of philosophy, it's about ideas, right? Or it's assumed to be about ideas. Now, many, many philosophers, of course, starting with Plato through the generations of philosophers, have touched on, hit on, and very directly pointed to this possibility of going beyond concept. And yet it gets covered over again and again. It gets hidden and obscured, just like in religions. Just like the possibility of enlightenment gets hidden and obscured within religions, even Buddhism. So that's the challenge. The challenge is the mind is very agile. The tendency to remain in the safe place of apparent knowing is strong. And I say apparent knowing because, again, it's dualistic knowing. To go beyond the dualistic experience of being yourself an emergent property inside consciousness is awakening. And you'll know consciousness in a way you never had before beyond that. And it's not in a way you can describe. That's the radicalness of it. And it's possible for anyone. And many watching this have already crossed that river. And that's the beginning. That's just the beginning. This rabbit hole goes deep. But anyone out there who's philosophical, who gets interested in these issues, materialism versus idealism, the hard problem of consciousness, what is consciousness? If that fascinates you, great. But ask yourself a question. Do I really want to know? And what am I willing to sacrifice for that knowledge? Am I willing to sacrifice my comfort? Am I willing to sacrifice my worldview and all of my scientific paradigms and philosophical paradigms to know? If you are, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. If you're not, you're just going to develop better and better and better theories, but they will all remain within the world of mind identification, as they have for thousands of years. So it's not about knowing, it's not about understanding or knowledge. It's not about better paradigms. That's not radical enough. It's not radical at all, really. Not in the relative scale of what it feels like to go right through the bottom of what you think your identity is. To let go of what you think you are, what you take yourself to be, even before you think about it. And to let go of that. To pluck up your life root. If you really want to know, go there. Knock and it will be open for you.